Katie, for having me. And it's great to be the closer. We saw Craig Kimbrell. I don't know why he was on that slide, but he was there because of me. That's right. I'm going to close today. Thank you. Actually, it's a privilege to close because I do want to, I think what you'll see and hear in what I have to say really does cut across all the panels we saw today, from the medium specificity of how different media carry narratives and the power resident in those different ways of telling stories, to the presentations we saw from Crystal and Kashif and Elizabeth about representation, to the comments here from Bridget and the others on the panel about the water we swim in. So I'm the executive director of the Peabody Awards, founded in 1940, before television even existed, at the University of Georgia. We've been in business for 78 years. It's the oldest and most prestigious award for broadcasting. We get 1,200 submissions. We give out 30 winners and 30 nominees. And the key here that I want you to see is across platforms and across genres. So what we're talking about is television, radio, podcasting, the web, digital, but entertainment, news, documentary, children's programming, public service. So this is going to be important as we go along. And the single criteria that we have is that these are stories that matter. And I think everybody in this room has talked about that all today. What I want to jump to the chase here with is what I've noticed is that the Peabody Board has given so many awards in certain subject or issue areas. So in race and criminal justice reform, we have given 19 awards in 3 years, in this issue area. Here are some of the documentaries, and of course you see Ava DuVernay's 13th, and last year the Khalif Browder story. The news here from Freddie Gray to Laquan McDonald. Entertainment, Atlanta, Blackish, The Night Of. And in radio podcasts, Serial Ear Hustle, actually prisoners being able to tell their own stories from within. 19 stories across 3 years that we've had the privilege to call to the attention. So Lena's charged to how do you get larger populations to see this work? Katie says that the Peabody Awards are a cultural validator. And so I think we have a privilege to call these stories to the public's attention, to put them on our app to try to raise the awareness of the citizenry to these powerful stories. So these are the themes that emerge from that. Police brutality, racialized policing, sentencing, bail system, solitary confinement, mass incarceration, blah, blah, blah. These are the themes that are articulated. And of course, what I want to point to as a professor is those medium tell those stories in different ways. A podcast is very different from a digital interactive web piece, which is very different than to hear the characters on Blackish talk about Sandra Bland. So, and police violence. So the point is that these stories add up, that the narratives, maybe the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that's what I want to talk to today. So I'm talking about a process, instead of accumulation, I like this $5 word, accretion, the process of growth that occurs through gradual accumulation. Think about that, the process of growth that occurs. So narrative accretion is the process of societal growth and change that happens through story accumulation. The right has been doing this for 30 years. There is your newspapers, there is your television, there is your religious broadcasting, there is your digital, there is your talk radio, there's your crazy info wars that used to be on community access television when I lived in Austin, Texas. The right knows what narrative accumulation is, but also we've been doing this. So this is the dissertation by Peabody Fellow at the Peabody Media Center, Dr. David Craig at USC. This was his doctoral work at UCLA. Between 1972 and 2014, there were 82, to be exact, LGBTQ TV movies. TV movies. I'm not talking documentaries. I'm not talking feature films. I'm talking about made-for-TV movies. So if you want to know how we begin to arrive at marriage equality and rights for LGBT citizens, these stories have mattered. And this may be familiar if you know Sally Pfeiffer and Sally Jo Pfeiffer and ITVS. Their initiative with Women and Girls Lead Global was an amazing undertaking with the Ford Foundation and with USAID in telling stories across really the Southern Hemisphere. And then 60 of those stories, Sally Jo made sure were broadcast in the United States. And when broadcasters said, we've already heard that story, she said, that's the point. You're going to hear it again. So narrative accumulation matters. So there's supporting scholarship. Let's go into professor mode real quick. Excuse me. That makes all this make sense. So George Lakoff, he's the guy who wrote Metaphors We Live By. That cognitive science says when you tell stories in certain ways, you begin to shape how we think. George Gerbner was the famous communication scholar at Annenberg East at University of Pennsylvania, the Cultural Indicators Project, where over 40 years they measured how narratives add up. And in particular, you may have heard before, the mean world syndrome, that irrespective of the low levels of crime in your community, if you saw violence on television over and over again, you tended to think that your community was a more dangerous place than it is. And then Martha Nussbaum, she's a philosopher who has written on the narrative imagination, where she talks about how art cultivates power of imagination, how it offers habits of empathy, and how it develops the arts of interpretation that are essential for civic participation. Think about those active verbs there. So why? Why does narrative accumulation work? So I want to introduce two propositions to you today. One is about the power of art and stories in changing society. And the other speaks to how and why audiences attend to different media and what they seek and derive from such engagements. But let's read this quote. Truth does not reveal itself by virtue of being the truth. It must be told. It must have stories woven around it, works of art made about it. It must be communicated in new ways and marketed so that it sells, by Stephen Duncombe in his book Dream, which I highly recommend. So there's a difference between recognition and seeing. Once we recognize an object, we really stop seeing it. Latinos as gangsters and thugs, Muslim as terrorists and threats. But art allows for estrangement from the habitual ways of seeing. Art helps us to see, not to recognize. It makes strange what has been familiar to us. Again, Martha Nussbaum on the narrative imagination writes, narrative art has the power to make us see the lives of the different with more than a casual tourist interest. Again, recognition. With involvement and sympathetic understanding, with anger at our society's refusals of visibility. My first argument then is that narrative accretion, the more stories we tell across platforms and genre, the more they reach the level of art, the more successful we will be in changing society. Second argument I'd make, hopefully we can see this. So where I stole it from has nothing to do with what I want to get to, but it was an article by Simon Cottle. And what he's doing here is in the inner circle, you see typical reporting frames in journalism. And in the outer circle, what you see is a more meta, what journalists are doing by telling stories in these frames. So you have the conflict and analytic frames on the right, propositional, argumentative, deliberative dialogue, conflict. And on the left, you have the more consensual and cultural display frames, community service, cultural recognition, mythic tales, collective interests, and then reporting and reportage as different ways of presentation. So what I want to do is extend this to say, look at the audience. We might note the different cognitive and emotional needs of audiences being met here. Information, debate, contestation, conflict, but also consensus and community, empathy, symbolic display. So again, think back across different media. When you listen to a podcast, what is it providing you? When you look at a digital web interactive, what is it allowing you to do if it's an immersive experience? If you watch an entertainment show, what subjective position have you identified in when that show makes you cry? So what I'm talking about here is there's a dialectic of the audience and citizen, meaning we're both audiences for this media, but we're also citizens. Or the ways that audiences use media to help constitute their citizenship. Because of course, citizenship is not just about voting. Early part of my career was making the case for how and why pop culture does this type of thing for us. To commune, to inform, to engage, to reify, to question, to represent. Audiences seek out media because it does this. This is how we engage public life through media. So I want to bring this to a close by saying my final proposition about narrative accretion. The different genres of narrative across different platforms in media have the potential to engage audiences in all of these ways, head and heart. Peabody has given 14 awards to sexual assault and harassment in 4 years. And think about the different ways of comedy and documentary and a news piece of Bill Cosby's victims and the protest and representation of Handmaid's Tale. Think about how each of those engaged you in understanding rape culture and violence against women. The shared themes gradually shift the way we see the world. Narratives lay down grooves in the collective mind and in our shared culture. So, and Bridget, I had this literally written here. This is the water we swim in. Thank you. You even brought up well, here, mine has a label. Anyway, this is the water we swim in. And so what I'm describing here is a cultural approach. And I'll do a pitch here. There's an array of ways to measure this outside of the traditional media effects work that dominates impact campaigns of single films. The Peabody Media Center is doing this type of work, and I'd love to talk to you more about how one goes about using a cultural qualitative approach to measure these things. But to draw this to a close, this is a narrative ocean, as Bridget says. But I'm actually hopeful. So one of the things the Peabody Media Center said is not just did 19 awards get recognized by Peabody, either through a winner or nominee, in race and criminal justice, 139 media properties were submitted to us for an award on race and criminal justice. 139. If you add 2018, 30 more. So 169. So this is the water. You guys are making the water. You guys are funding the water. You guys are doing this. So I'm actually extremely hopeful when I look at the grantees in the Southern Documentary Fund and International Documentary Association. Women, people of color, Muslims, Southern rednecks, you know? There's stories, I'm from Alabama, y'all, so I get to do that. There's stories to be told there. When I see the grantees of Knight and Ford and MacArthur and Wincote, when I see the fellows at the Pop Culture Collaborative, when I talk to showrunners who tell me that Netflix is mandating that when you write that script about a trans character, it will be a trans writer in the writer's room and a Latino in the writer's room. When I talk to Amazon and FX and see that they have documentary units and Nat Geo. When I work with my students when we choose the Futures of Media Award in digital storytelling in VR and in video games and in webisodes and in mobile media and in interactive docs, and I see the types of inspiring narratives that are taking these digital affordances and telling very powerful stories that we've never heard before, precisely through these types of immersive or engaging new things that digital allows us to do. So in sum, I would say, keep telling your stories. They do add up. They will make a difference. Flip the script.